This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, I talked to Peter Brunette, Reynolds Professor of Film Studies and Director of the Film Studies Program at Wake Forest University. He's the author of the newest volume in the University of Illinois Press's Contemporary Film Directors series, Michael Haneke. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Peter Brunette is the Reynolds Professor of Film Studies and Director of the Film Studies Program at Wake Forest University. He's written a new volume in the University of Illinois Press's Contemporary Film Directors series on the filmmaker behind the likes of The Seventh Continent, Funny Games, Caché, and more recently, The White Ribbon. He's also a director whose name, as the Academy Awards taught us, has more than one pronunciation. Which one do you go for?
It's supposed to be Haneke.
Haneke, okay. And as for the first name?
Michael.
Okay, the standard Michael Haneke, okay. Because I heard a few different pronunciations around the Academy Awards time, and it just sent a lot of his fans in the U.S. into confusion. But in any case, Peter, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, you've written books on directors before, on Antonioni, Rossellini, Wong, Kar-Wai. Where does Michael Haneke fit into this personal constellation of directors that summon enough of your interest to certainly write a book about?
That's a very great question. I think every book I've ever written has come from a desire to understand a kind of an idea more than anything else. People are always disappointed when they ask me biographical questions about a director I've written on, because I never know anything about their biography. I'm just fascinated by certain ideas that come up in their films and want to think about them more.
Now, are you fascinated about whatever ideas a certain filmmaker might happen to have, or how filmmakers are driven by ideas, or are you fascinated by certain ideas and thus the filmmakers that happen to work with those ideas, if that makes any sense as a question?
Sure. I think it's the former rather than the latter, because it's not so much what the idea is, it's that there's an idea that attracts me greatly. So, for example, my very first book was on Roberto Rossellini, the Italian director, and what I was largely concerned with there was the whole question of realism. You know, what do we mean when we say that a film is realistic? Then out of that grew this book on Rossellini. Of course, it also gave me the chance to do my research in Italy, which was a bit calculated on my part, but I really was wondering about that idea of realism. And the same thing with Haneke. It's more the question of violence, the media critique, and some of the other interesting things, because I'd heard about him for years before I actually wrote about him.
Did you get any chances to go to France or Germany with the Haneke research?
No, mostly I sort of was already there.
I see.
I went to his press conference, as a matter of fact, at Cannes last year, and I go to Cannes every year. This will be my 20th year going there. And he's actually Austrian, so I have spent some time in Vienna, but he's kind of a formidable figure, and I had heard lots of things about how he scares people, so I kind of stayed away from him. I wanted to stick to the films.
What are these stories that you heard about him scaring people? Because, of course, you watch the movies and you understand how the movies could scare some people. But the man himself?
Apparently, he can be a bit of a bear, or maybe more than a bit, on the set. I've heard of various encounters with actors that he's quite brutalized. There's the German version of Funny Games. He even talks about it himself in an interview that I translated for the book. That the character played by Suzanne Lothar is actually reduced to a sort of quivering mass, a lump of humanity, and he sort of is very proud of that, because I think they did 20 takes of this one horrible kind of torture scene, and he got what he wanted, and he's just one of those guys who's a very serious artist, and everything for art.
Aren't there also the articles out there, though, and I think, for example, of Anthony Lane's recent one in the New Yorker, saying that they expected kind of the worst of Haneke's behavior, but they actually found that he acted somewhat happy in real life, and that came as a surprise as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. He has such a forbidding appearance. I don't know if you've seen pictures of him. There's
Yes.
one reproduced in the book, but he's got this, sort of white hair and white beard and piercing look. He just looks like, sort of a German philosopher who is going to crack his ruler over your knuckles if you don't give the right answer. But I have heard these stories that in fact in real life he's quite nice. It's when he's on the set apparently, and when he's doing his artist thing, he really has to have it exactly the way he wants it.
Now, how did you first encounter his films?
Well, I had heard about them before I got a chance to see them. These are the two earlier films. One is called Benny's Video, and the other is in fact the original German version of Funny Games. And I had heard that they were very troubling and that they were about the question of violence and the depiction of violence in the media. And I was always intrigued by them, but I never got around to seeing them. And then I think the first film I actually saw of his was, it's called in French Code Inconnu, or just Code Unknown, with Juliette Binoche. That was his first French film, and I was really intrigued by it. And I thought that there's somebody here who had some ideas and was working, sort of pushing the envelope, as it were. I mean, his film after that, The Pianist, with Isabelle Huppert, is very edgy and very. The figure is a masochist, sadomasochist sort of, and it's a very kind of sick relationship she has, and naturally that's immensely intriguing. Those kind of sick films, because you want to. There's so many boring films out there that you want to be, I won't say titillated, but you want to be challenged. You want to be pushed beyond your normal limits, I think.
And certainly Haneke himself has had much to say about how he wants to challenge the audience, how he wants to move away from their expectations. Now, you mentioned the ideas that drive his films, and you also mentioned, of course, the film The Pianist, or also known as The Piano Teacher in some regions, that is a bit of an outlier to my mind as an adaptation from a novel, from other material that wasn't his originally written. How wide a range of ideas does Haneke's body of work encompass? Is he playing to your mind on similar sets of ideas every time, or is he jumping around a lot as far as the specific ideas he works with? I suppose the question comes down more to, is each film, to your mind, more an outgrowth of this sort of central core of Haneke ideas, or is he taking on different ones each time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think he's done himself somewhat of a disservice by focusing on this question of violence. Naturally, that's the kind of thing that gets the headlines, and people are either repelled or attracted to that kind of exploration. And the implication of the involvement of the audience. This is especially true in Funny Games. And I actually take him to task for that in the book, because I don't think that he really is very coherent when he talks about those things. And I think what it really covers up is the fact that what he really is a good old-fashioned art film director, in the sense that, first of all, his technical style in his earlier films is very, very obtuse, and in the good sense, very difficult to, you have to pay attention every second to see who the characters are. I mean, he gives you absolutely no help whatsoever. But it's more, his earlier films are more a critique of society and of the way, that we're no longer human with each other, that we've lost the ability to communicate. These grand old humanist themes, kind of Ingmar Bergman, Antonioni. He's kind of a throwback, or actually he's 67 years old, so he's kind of at the tail end of that generation of the great directors of the 60s and 70s. So I think he's gotten a little bit of notoriety, maybe a lot of notoriety about this question of violence and its depiction in the media, but I don't think that's the real Haneke.
And so you might say then that the ideas he's talked about making films about, and everyone would always say media violence, because the specter of media violence is so obviously at the surface of his movies. You find more interesting the themes of what I'll say is the humanity's loss of recognition of sort of the common humanity of everyone?
Yes, and I think also it also tends to have a specific historical valence as well. So, for example, I asked him a question at the Cannes Film Festival during the press conference, because I think I'm one of the few people in the world that's seen his earlier films, because he actually made films for 15 years for television before he began making theatrical films. And now, of course, Austrian and German television are very different from American television. So these are tough art films. But I really think that in his new film, The White Ribbon, he's going back to some of the grand old themes of a film that he made in 1979 called The Lemmings, which is a critique, a socio-historical critique of intergenerational conflict. So in other words, it's the whole question of as in the new film, of the way that the elder generation tortures and kind of mistreats the younger generation, and then the way this leads to grand historical horrible consequences like World War II and Nazism, etc. And I think he's going back to that now with his new film, which I love tremendously, and even though it's gotten some negative reviews here and there, I think they've really missed the point.
Now, you mentioned his older films, the films that began his career, the television films, and those are ones that people in the U.S., even his fans in the U.S., probably won't have seen. I personally have seen all of his theatrically released films, except for the new one, The White Ribbon. I've seen one of his TV films, which is The Castle, the one that's had the wide DVD release. What can you tell us about what could you tell somebody who, like myself, has seen the majority of the theatrical films, has not seen the majority of the television films, about how they compare to one another, how those clusters compare to one another?
Well, he takes up different subjects. They're very, you're right, no one in the United States has seen them. Roy Grundman, who's a professor at Boston University and runs the film program there, he collected all of the major Haneke films that were made for television in the 70s, I guess, for the most part, and put on a traveling show that was at various museums around the country, especially on the East Coast, and that was fantastic. And he has a new book out as well, an edited collection with Blackwell on Haneke, and I have an essay in there on this early film I was telling you about, made in 1979, a television film called The Lemmings. And, they're just very tough and uncompromising. There's suicides and, people slitting their wrists and slitting each other's wrists, and they're very tough movies. I have a theory that in Germany, and I think he agrees with this. I mean, there are instances of this in his interviews. In Germany, they've spent so much time coming to grips with the guilt produced by World War II and the Holocaust. And so in Germany, typically in intellectual circles, you get this breast beating that has lasted for decades and decades and decades, which I think is fine. In Austria, however, it's been exactly the opposite. They participated, as we know, many Austrians, very happily in the Nazi movement, but yet there's this little out that they have, and that's that, we were the first victims. When Hitler took over Austria, the famous Anschluss, 1938. But, when you look at the pictures, you see all of those Viennese people with their arms raised in the fascist Nazi salute, and looking very, very happy about Hitler's advent. So, at any rate, Haneke himself talks about this, that Austria has never really faced its guilt the way Germany has. And so the writers and the artists and the filmmakers in Austria are almost berserk at times with their anger at the middle class and at this refusal to face the consequences of history. So their novels, the novel that the piano teacher's taken from is by Elfriede Jelinek, as you know, who won the Nobel Prize. And I read that novel to see how he adapted it, and it's almost berserk with anger and violence at her own countrymen and hatred. So it's so intense. And I think a lot of that comes out in the television films. That would be the primary difference, I think.
The first Haneke film I saw was the first Haneke film a lot of people in the U.S. saw, which was Caché. Came out in, I believe, 2005. And I was immediately taken by the filmmaking of it, just the pure cinematic qualities of the movie. Those won me over. I did feel like there was maybe more direct lecturing of the middle class than I would have liked, but that's sort of washed away by the quality of the film itself. Now, you mentioned that he's angry at the middle class. In the book as well, I believe you quote him as saying that he makes films about the middle class because he comes from the middle class and that's what he knows. But there might also be an element of wherever he came from, that's what he would be angry at.
No, I think it's just one of those things that people who are making films tend to come from the middle class. And since the middle class run things in most societies, they are the ones responsible for this guilt, and they produce directors and writers who attack them. This is a kind of a classic gesture throughout history, of course, is that's the middle class writer or artist who attacks the middle class for being middle class, even though they came from that milieu. I think that's more where it comes from.
What does he actually seem to think from an examination of his films? What does he seem to think of the middle class? My favorite film of his is the Seventh Continent, the first one that you cover in the book, and that it seems like even more of an indictment of the emptiness or what have you of the middle class than any of his other films. But what opinion does he seem to actually hold of this class?
He's very interested in his films, as you know, of showing body parts, for example. Many of his films, for the first 10 or 15 minutes, all you see are your feet or arms or legs before you're allowed to begin to identify with the characters. He knows exactly what he's doing. Actually, he could be a wonderful Hollywood director if he didn't hate everything that Hollywood stands for. He really knows how to hold attention and a kind of suspense in the audience. He'd be a great filmmaker of horror films and thriller films. I think if that's the way he wanted to go. That's what's going on in those films.
And to get back to some of the ideas that drive his filmmaking, now you've mentioned, of course, the sort of less interesting of the ideas that's at work, which is the critique of media violence. And you can hear him and read him and see him talk about that theme directly in a lot of interviews, especially the ones that come with the U.S. region DVDs. Most of them have interviews on them, and he'll talk about what he thinks about media violence. And I too find that the less interesting of the ideas he works with. But how seriously do you think he takes his own critique of media violence? I know that's maybe asking you to be psychic in a certain sense, but how seriously does he seem to take that himself in terms of all the themes he works with? Do you think that media violence really is as important to him as an interview might make you believe it is?
Well, it's this old problem of how do you represent something without exacerbating the desire the audience has to see that. For example, there are many directors in history, Rossellini, Mizoguchi in Japan, who make films about the travails of women. But of course, in the making of those films, they also get to torture women. So there's this kind of reverse accidental effect. Another great example, I think, is Clockwork Orange, which is touted as, at any rate, as a film that is against violence, and is one of the most violent films I've ever seen. So, to what in the representation of what you're trying to be against, you can just feed that fire, and I think that's a problem. But the media violence stuff, I think what's so most important and most interesting in his films about that is the way he deals with it in terms of the formal techniques he uses and the doubling. So, for example, you never know in Cachet, exactly what the source of any image is. So he destabilizes the image. And you never know at any moment whether you're watching a video that's done by some unknown person that you never discover who it is, or whether it's Haneke's shot, in other words, in the film proper. So he's keeping you on your toes. And I mean, watching one of his films, as you know yourself, having seen all of the theatrical films, you have to pay attention. You can't nod off. You can't think about other things because you'll miss something crucial.
And indeed, the way he deals with mediation itself, I always find interesting. But when he approaches media violence more directly, I find those efforts to be slightly weaker. Now, and you have a chapter, of course, on Funny Games, one on the original, one on the remake, and that's, I think, his best-known film. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem to find it the weakest. Is that true?
I think it's not so much the weakest as the most wrong-headed. In that I think he wants to punish his audience. And he's very open about this, that the reason he made this film was to show the audience exactly how complicit they are in the violence that they are enjoying. And he says, for example, if people are so much against this violence, then why don't they get up and leave? And it just seems to me completely bogus. I mean, for one thing, people, after you've paid $8 or $10, you're going to stay. And first of all, just on a really kind of stupid level, and then on another level, you want to see what happens. It's only normal. So he has this idea. This is why I think the second Funny Games, the American version, didn't work at all. He has this idea about he wants to critique people who watch thriller films or violent films. But in fact, the kind of people who watch his films are people who like art films, and they don't like those kind of films. So he was betwixt and between, in the sense that the kinds of people he wanted to attack would never go see a Haneke film in a million years. And the people who would go see a Haneke film don't want to see all that violence. So I think it just didn't work, because there are a lot of asides you remember, and where the audience is brought in, the killers, the torturers of the family. I mean, it's a very tough movie to take, to see an entire family basically tortured to death over an hour and a half. But, I mean, it's a powerful movie also in some of its ideas. For example, the remote control on the television when they decide to, the Suzanne Lothar character, she grabs a hold of the remote control, and the entire scene of the movie is rewound. I mean, those are some really interesting Brechtian ideas, I think. But overall, I think as a critique of the media depiction of violence, it doesn't work.
Here's the thing that I think about the remake of Funny Games, because of course it was a big question. Why would he bother simply changing the location and essentially shot for shot remaking it? And I remember, to bring up Anthony Lane again, his New Yorker review, I believe the thrust of that was he was with it in 97. In 2008 or whenever it was, he's no longer with the times with this critique. But I think you just mentioned how the events of the film, you essentially see, yes, a lot of torture from near the beginning to the end. And I think, in a way, Anthony Lane is right that it's maybe too late for the critique, but in a way, isn't that now a legitimate horror subgenre? I mean, there are people who are specifically into the all-torture subgenre of horror, so it would seem to also have been the time for it as well. What's your stance on how relevant the critique he's actually making is? Because on one hand, it seems like it is not, like it is very much of the mid-90s. But on the other hand, it seems like, well, there are actual horror movies made without the winking at the audience that Funny Games has that are essentially the same otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really buy that Anthony Lane argument. I just think it's hard for me to tell, because I watched the first film in German and was moved by it and shaken by it. Not moved in the sense of emotionally overwhelmed or anything like that, but just kind of grossed out by it. And I wanted to find out and discover what was the source of that, and to explore that a little bit. To me, it was more, the American version was more just boring, in the sense of, all right, now he's got his audience that he wants, but nobody's going to go see a film like this. I remember I saw it a couple of years ago on Easter Sunday, as a matter of fact, and there were 4 other people in the audience in my local art house theater. And I remember after the movie was over, one person turned to the other, one of the other 4 people, and said, "What the hell was that about?" I mean, mean, they were people who had gone to see a film with Naomi Watts and Tim Roth that was billed as a horror film, just thriller, whatever you want to call it, and they couldn't make heads or tails of all the Brechtian effects and the turning and looking at the camera and supposedly indicting and incriminating the audience. I mean, they had no idea what any of that stuff was there for.
It does seem a little strange to me, though, that the breaking of the fourth wall would, to this day, be regarded as that weird.
Yeah, but I think, it's done. If it's done for humor, then it goes way, way back, and it's been around forever, and it works very well, and there's no problem with that. We've seen many, many films where a character in a comedy will suddenly look at the camera and make a little comment, and that's great. But when it's in a serious movie, when it's in a drama, that we're not used to, I think, even today. I can't think of a single other film that is a serious drama in which that fourth wall is broken down. We don't want to have that messed with, I think. If it's part of the laugh, that's fine.
I see. That is true. Now, when Haneke says, and he's oft quoted as saying this, when he says that he can't stand suffering, he can't even bear the idea of violence, do you believe literally that that's true?
That's a great question. I think it is true, or I think, let's put it this way, I think he thinks it's true, and that's why he's on this crusade. But then again, you get back to that kind of Clockwork Orange factor that I mentioned earlier. Somebody who is that drawn to the depiction of something is also interested in that thing, and not merely in a scolding kind of way. There's some other kind of deeper interest going on there. And I think only Haneke's psychiatrist or therapist could really help us on that one. But I think I'm just so attracted to him because he's a good old-fashioned art film director. You have to work at his films. It's not something, you come home and, you grab beer and I'm going to really relax. No, these are tough films that, on lots of different levels, sort of emotional, psychological, but also just artistically, and really having to piece these things together. And that's exciting in an age when things seem to be getting stupider and easier all the time. It's nice to be challenged.
I do want to get into this idea of Haneke as a good old art film director, because does that mean that you are seeing less of his breed around in the younger generations? That would seem to me to be the implication there.
Yeah, that's a great question. My own personal take is that, and this is an idea I've had for years, and I don't know whether it's still true or not, but I still keep inflicting it on my students. And that's the idea that the salvation of the art film is perhaps lies in some kind of a marriage with the genre film. So where things, for example, just something that just popped into my mind, a film like Memento. That's an exciting film, but it's also a film with a lot of ethical questions involved and artistic questions. So, but it's also a thrilling, film about somebody killing somebody, maybe not, and what happened. It's a real brain teaser. So I think that combination is perhaps the future of art films, and I think Haneke tries to do that. For example, Cachet is very very suspenseful. You're sitting on the edge of your seat trying to figure out what's going on, who's making these films, just as the characters in the film are.
This idea of the salvation of the art film being a bit of a, what word do I want to use? Maybe a hybridization with the genre film. Does that mean more that that is where more new relevance for the art film might lie, or is it more that it's the only artistic direction that might be left to go in a creatively profitable sense, or is it in the sense that, well, that's the way that people can get going to art films again? In which way do you mean that?
I think all of the above.
Oh, really?
Really, yeah. It's the market for art films is just shrinking and shrinking, and now with the different platforms available, really no one knows what's going on at this point. Whether we will still be watching movies in movie theaters in 10 or 20 years. The entire box office historically for foreign films in the United States has been about 1% of the overall box office. So it's a really tiny amount of money, but then we're a very big country. I mean, it's a tiny percentage, but it actually ends up being a lot of money. And you get, interestingly, like British directors, like Mike Leigh and Ken Loach, complain that, in fact, it's only in the United States that their British films, can make money or make back the money that has been put into them, because, ironically, it is American Hollywood films that have grabbed all of the screens in the UK. So their films can't be shown. So they have to, in a weird reversal, they have to come to the United States to, attract this art crowd to make their films break even. So, especially because of the language thing there, you don't have that problem as you do in other countries with translation and dubbing and subtitling and all that. So the British art film especially is in very serious trouble. And there are other countries, Brazil might have 90% of its box office is from American films, which is a shame. I mean, you understand why we tell stories well. That's what American filmmakers do very, very well. But it drowns out these other voices that I think, especially in Brazil, for example, Brazilians need to hear other Brazilians.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. My guest is Peter Brunette, Reynolds Professor of Film Studies and Director of the Film Studies program at Wake Forest University. He's written the latest volume in the University of Illinois Press's Contemporary Film Directors series on the filmmaker Michael Haneke. If you enjoyed this interview, you might also enjoy the ones we've recorded with Livia Bloom on the works of Errol Morris and with director Ramin Barani, one of the neo-realists. You can find those in the Marketplace of Ideas archive at colinmarshallradio.com. Now, back to the conversation. And then I think of the reception to, say, The White Ribbon, Haneke's new one. That seems to have been made quite a big deal of. Is there any glimmer of hope to be found in the way that this film has been received, that perhaps the art film is gaining relevance once again, is working out like you said?
Well, yeah, I hope so, but it seems to me also a variant of the question, the big fish in the small pond or the small fish in the big pond, and or vice versa. I think I accidentally reversed that, but you and I, because we run in certain circles, I've heard a lot about the White Ribbon. But the great, unwashed masses of human beings in America, I'm sure, have no idea what the White Ribbon is and have never heard of it. It's always, my whole life is art films and foreign films and documentaries. So it's always a bit of a kind of a sobering moment for me in the Academy Awards when the Foreign Film Oscar is given, such short shrift. So, for example, they're on and off in a few seconds. Something that I know is so important to the directors and so important to the people nominated, in so many ways around the world, funding, whether they're going to make films in the future, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, on the Academy Awards, it's 2 minutes.
Yes.
And then you sort of say, oh, gee, I guess foreign films really aren't that important to the rest of the world as they are to me. So I think that's, in our circle, in other words, the people that read Anthony Lane in the New Yorker, we've all heard of the White Ribbon, but, I don't think the art market is robust right now, the art film market. But, yeah, I always have hope. It's a great film. I live in Winston-Salem, and our local art house theater, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, my local art house theater had a screening where I did a little Q&A and discussion afterward, and it was packed, and people, I could feel that they were on the edge of their seat the entire time. They were sort of a collective holding of breath throughout the whole movie because he sustains that tension, and it's such a beautiful movie in that black and white. I just found it very, very powerful. And it has nothing to do with the media. It's set in 1913. And, he said he was getting off the media now, whether that, at the press conference, now whether that lasts for a while or not, I don't know. I think he realizes that is a kind of a dead subject and that, things are the way they are. And there's not much he can do about it. So he should return to larger themes of, this sort of historical and just larger humanistic themes are more important now.
Yes, it does seem the buzz around the White Ribbon indicates that it is a signal of a new direction in Haneke's career. And I think back to the sort of the most media violence intensive period of his career, to 92, to Benny's Video, which I love, but which seems badly dated in some respects, and to Funny Games, of course, as we talked about, the most direct of the media violence indictments that he's made. And to get a general shape of his career across, after Funny Games, we do seem to see a change in theme, sort of already right there. The media violence becomes less overt. He seems to broaden out to a different set of ideas. Would you agree with that, first of all?
Are you talking about, did you say after Benny's Video?
After Funny Games.
Oh, after Funny Games, yeah. Well, I think he wants a wider market at that point also. This is also one of the realities of filmmaking. If you make films in German, they just don't have as wide a spread as films, say, in French. So I think he wanted to work with other actors, and because this is right after Funny Games is when he makes his first French film. And Juliette Binoche wrote to him and apparently said, I'd like to make a film with you sometime. And he just really jumped on that. And I think he may have realized that was kind of a dead end for him. He lived in Paris for a while, and then he went back and lived in Vienna. And it's really interesting that he has gone back to making films in German. And I wonder how long that will last. And I think he's probably just trying to maximize his possibilities. I don't know whether he'll ever come back to Hollywood or ever make a film in English again. I seriously doubt that. One of my favorite films. I mean, my favorite films are actually the early ones, the ones that you pointed out that you liked.
Yes.
The Seventh Continent is such a powerful, disturbing film. I think partly because it's based on a true story, in which this family, as you know, just completely destroys all of its possessions and itself, and makes that choice to not. And he never explains. Because he says, I think a beautiful quote of his is, how can you possibly ever capture the truth of somebody's actions in a 2-hour movie or even in a 300-page novel? You can't ever fully capture the intentions and the implications of something. So I'm not even going to try. So some people are very angry with him because they think that the role of the artist is to give answers to the questions he or she raises. And Haneke obviously just refuses that. Now, I think in The White Ribbon, my one little complaint about it is that I think he kind of artificially, at the end, maybe introduces his patented mystery, a couple of elements at the end that I won't go into, so as not to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it. And that may be getting to be a little bit of a fetish on his part. There's always this unexplained thing. And, of course, his other great moment that in Cachet, for example, is his other powerful technique is that intense moment of a sudden violence, which still has makes me jump out of my seat every single time I see that movie, Caché, and also it's in Unknown Code in the metro scene. I remember there's just this outburst of violence or hatred or something that just really sets your teeth on edge and is unforgettable.
Now, this idea of of actual reality not being conveyable in art, that's probably the most interesting to me personally idea that Haneke works with. And you mentioned that there's some backlash to that as well, that angers some people, but it seems that to me that at least that drives the parts of his pure filmmaking skill that are the most interesting. I mean, how do you see that idea that reality can't be fully represented, or how do you see that idea itself represented in the way that he shoots, the way that he edits, the way his films are assembled?
I think he just refuses to answer all the questions. I mean, there's at the very end of Caché, that long shot of the school entrance. Suddenly we see the two sons. This will be completely mysterious to anybody who hasn't seen the movie, but if you look closely at that very last shot, you see the Arab son and Daniel Auteuil's son standing there together. And suddenly you wonder, oh my God, maybe Daniel Auteuil's son made the film. You just have absolutely no idea. I mean, I find those things totally intriguing and exciting because again, something to think about. It's just, I felt that in the white ribbon, maybe the little thing at the end was a little artificially introduced. But generally, I think that's marvelous, because he does. It's just that he rejects this kind of the facile quality of so much media analysis in the film that you mentioned. You saw 71 fragments in the TV news that he talks about. The people keep talking about. The newscaster keeps saying this is an inexplicable act of violence. An inexplicable act of violence. You know, and Haneke shows through these 71 fragments how, true story again, how this cadet could have been led to murder all these people in a bank. But he lets you put the pieces together. He doesn't lead you through them. He gives you the 71 fragments, and you have to piece it together yourself. I think that's different.
How much does it matter to you, purely as a viewer, that, let's take one of these mysteries that are his signature, let's take the mystery in Caché. How much does it matter to you that there is or is not an actual answer to the question of who made the videos in Haneke's mind? Does it matter to you if he constructs it to be unanswerable, or does it matter to you if he constructs it in an unanswerable way, but he has an answer in his mind? Or does anything beyond what's actually there on the screen affect how much you enjoy some element like this in a movie of his?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. I mean, you never know to what extent he has something in his mind, or whether it's kind of artificially introducing a mystery element just for the sake of it. I don't think, for example, the film Doubt, apparently, you know, we never know at the end of that whether the priest is guilty of what he's accused of or not. And I've heard that the director said, oh, you know, there is an answer, but I'm not telling you. Well, I've never heard Haneke say that. I think he's doing something more like human reality and human actions and human consciousness are ultimately inexplicable. And so why in the world would I make a 2-hour movie in which I explain everything? Because it is so false to reality and so false to our lived experience. I'm going to give you a sense in which, present to you a little bit more what real life is like. I mean, you know, the artificiality of fiction, for example, we know more about the characters than we even know about ourselves, let alone about other people. You know, when you probe, you know, somebody's doing a stream of consciousness or whatever, well, we barely understand ourselves, let alone other people. And yet in novels or in films, we're expected to completely understand the motivations for the actions of all the characters. But that's just so unlifelike. So I think, to me, it doesn't bother me at all. It's only a movie, after all. To me, it's the construction. My students go crazy because I can never remember how movies end. And they say, well, you know, what happens at the end? Now, there's the guy. I said, gee, I can't remember. What? I mean, they're astonished because for them, it's sort of the intrigue of the plot is most important in their minds, I think. Whereas for me, it's striking moments, ideas that are used and played with. I rarely pay attention to plot. And I know that makes me a little bit weird, but makes my students laugh at me. But, you know, it's just the way it is. I'm sure you're the same way. You know, you'll remember an image from a movie you saw 20 years ago, but you absolutely have no idea about anything else about it. You know, who was who, what the story was.
Indeed. Well, this is why some of my favorite filmmakers also are, you know, names like Abbas Kiarostami or Peter Greenaway. These are not plot guys.
No, definitely not. They're tough guys. And this is my mission in life, is to get my students to like these people. Especially, I'm teaching a course now called Recent Asian Cinema. And as you know, the long take aesthetic is used extensively in Asian cinema, including Iranian cinema. And so, God, that is some labor. That is missionary work. I'll tell you. You know, it takes about 6 weeks for them to, you know, kind of get off of their MTV stone caffeinated high, where everything has to cut every 2 seconds to appreciate that long take. But, you know, about 50% of the class usually comes along by the end of it. So it's missionary work that I hope is having some kind of result.
Now, this gets into something I very much want to know about, which is, given your experience teaching students, what idea can you give us of students' reaction to the films of Michael Haneke when you have, I don't know if you've taught a class on him or what, but surely you've had some experience of screening these films for students.
I have. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine and I co-taught 2 years ago a course, an honors course, in which Haneke was one of three figures that we covered. And I gave them typescript versions, sent them out to files of my chapters that were ready then, but hadn't been completely finished. And they seemed to be really intrigued by it and very interested by it, and actually very bothered by the violence. I mean, I think we have this image of, the oldsters are the ones that are bothered by violence, and the kids are used to it, but my students were very upset about it. But what was wonderful for me is when I did this thing that I mentioned the other day, a couple of weeks ago at my local art house theater, and I did this Q&A that was a little bit advertised for the White Ribbon. 2 of the students from that honors class, whom I hadn't seen for 2 years, showed up. Oh. And they said, we got so entranced by Haneke, we wanted to see the next film. And so I was really encouraged by that this very difficult, very, in many ways, again, and very demanding auteur, did have some interest for a 20-year-old. That greatly encouraged me, I must say.
Is this representative of the student reaction you've seen, that Haneke is able to draw students, or even, let's widen it out to just viewers, his abilities to his, what we've called kind of his Hollywood abilities that he uses in moderation, those draw students and others in, and then he's kind of got them at that point?
Well, no, I think not. I think it's the kind of people, the kind of students who read Virginia Woolf and James Joyce maybe are the kind of students who would be interested in Haneke. I think his ability to manipulate people and manipulate his audience, which is a very important idea for him, the responsibility of the filmmaker as well in the manipulation of the audience, because that's what films are. We go there to be manipulated and to be, have emotions wrung from us and all of that. I think they're more interested in that. In other words, a certain type of what Bourdieu, the French sociologist, called the habitus. It's if you read the New Yorker, you're probably also going to be somebody who reads the New York Times, and also somebody who goes to see art films. That kind of idea. I think that's the kind of student that is interested in Haneke. I think the vast majority, would find him utterly boring because they think of movies. Students really have to be educated in the concept of the art film. They really don't even know what that is anymore. I mean, to them, the movies are something that occur at the mall, and you eat popcorn with them, and they're supposed to be mindless, and they're supposed to be escapist, and they're supposed to be just fun. So that's the trouble I have, the first few weeks of a beginning course especially, is to try to explain to students that there is this other tradition, that it's okay to read, airport novels. It's okay to read Tom Clancy. Those are fine. But, you also have to read James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, and then maybe there's a little bit more there, or Proust, or whomever. And these filmmakers are the equivalent of those greater writers that last a little bit longer and aren't so easily digested.
Now, with his attitude toward the manipulation of the audience, he talks about, in the interviews you quote him talking about how he manipulates the audience. He talks about Hollywood doing the same, and I'm certain we can say Michael Haneke manipulates his audience, as well as Steven Spielberg, manipulates his audience, but it's, of course, very different manipulation. But in what way is the manipulation different? Is Haneke more aware of his own audience manipulation, or is he more sort of reflexive about it? How can we separate these two kinds of audience manipulation that say these two would do?
Well, I think he tried 2 different ways, and one does not work very well, I think, and that is the funny games way, and that is by making the audience aware that it's being manipulated and making the audience come to grips with its own involvement in what is being shown and its own acceding to that kind of violence and image making. I don't think people really want to hear that. I mean, there is this side to Haneke, the scold, the one who's trying to improve us, that I think people don't respond to very well. The second way, I think, works better for him. And what he says is, in some of his interviews, he points out that he tries to manipulate as little as possible. In other words, manipulate the image. But he admits openly that, of course, that's what the movies are about. And he says at one point, I think I quoted as the epigraph of the book, something to the effect that we don't get reality. All we have, we never get the real image. We get a manipulated image. That's the best we can do. So, I think that, he accepts that, but tries to make it for a larger purpose. In other words, you're being manipulated, but yes, but it's not for cheap thrills, or worse, for some kind of provoking of some excitement about violence and death and murder and torture, but in fact, you are being manipulated for the purpose of some larger realization, some more transcendental realizations about the nature of human life and humanity, and again, all these great themes that go back, Ingmar Bergman and before.
Some sort of nobler, higher manipulation.
As it were, yes.
Now,
manipulation in a good cause.
In writing the book, I assume that you must have done multiple re-viewings of films of Haneke, as you've seen many times already. What did you find, or what have you found in the course of writing this book? Not what specific films, but what aspects of Haneke prove to be the richest in terms of, you watch these films so many times, what wells run less dry than others when you have to go back to these so many times? What do you keep an eye on in Haneke that just endlessly rewards paying attention to?
Yeah, great question. Two things, I think. First of all, the play of ideas. There's always an intelligent consciousness there that I feel the presence of. And I've talked to so many of my friends at lunch and other times about the White Ribbon, because they've all been kind of blown away by it. I mean, I originally thought about it a year ago, but just the way that ideas come together suddenly in an image, usually, and that's the second thing that really attracts me to him, and that is the power of the image, because he talks about how fearful he is of the power of the image, and that he tries to kind of deconstruct or defang its power in some ways. And yet you could see that he's really an artist deep down, and he makes these beautiful images. I mean, in the White Ribbon, when you get to see it, there's a new technique, well, not so new now. It was used in a Coen Brothers film a number of years ago with Billy Bob Thornton, the one about the barber, I forget the name. But what they do now for black and white movies is they shoot them in color, and then they take the color out. So what is left is not really black and white, but this kind of richer, creamier black and white. It's not as flat as the old black and white used to be. And it just gleams off of the screen. I mean, you just want to dive into those images, and just each one, each moment in his film seems to be like a painting or an Ansel Adams, rather, in this film, an Ansel Adams photograph hanging on the wall, and you just want to just linger with that image forever. And I think he has a real ability there. Yet you also feel this same tension that he has, that he knows the power of the image, and he's frightened about that because it sucks you in. And so there's this kind of internal squabbling kind of going on, you feel inside him, about how much to give in to this predilection he has for the beautiful image.
It seems like that's a broader theme of his career. When I watch his movies, I do think about there being, whether it's true or not, a conflict between what he wants, what his stated goals are, and the way he has to achieve them. Of course, this is the clearest with his whole media violence period. He has to use media violence to indict it. It seems like, is it accurate at all to say that happens for many of the ideas, if not all of them, he works with? He has to somehow use the thing he wants to critique.
Yeah, that is, true. Film and television are media, and he's implicated. And I think even in Funny Games, he realizes and recognizes that he's implicating himself to some extent. There's part of him in Funny Games that is, lecturing the audience about how bad they are. And then there's another part in which I think he realizes that, wait a minute, this audience is seeing this film through my film, and so that I'm implicated in my own images here. I think that's one of the exciting things about him all the way through. But, the other thing that's interesting, and I don't know, as a cultural studies person, I don't always agree with him, but he really has an old-fashioned idea. I use old-fashioned kind of in a neutral sense here of art as redemptive. It's something you don't hear much anymore. Maybe on NPR stations you do, but this idea that hearing Beethoven or seeing Rembrandt paintings or whatever is good for you. It redeems the dross and the pain of life. He really believes that. He really believes in art with a capital A. And while I'm doubtful myself about it sometimes, I guess I've read too much cultural studies theory, I respect that. And you feel that power, because his belief is so strong in the redemptive power of art to transcend our problems, to make us better people. It kind of rubs off on you. You feel that yourself, I think.
The book, once again, is Michael Haneke from the Contemporary Film Directors Series. Peter Brunette, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program.
It was great to talk to you. Really enjoyed it. Thanks.
This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. If you have any feedback, positive, negative, neutral, whatever, or any questions, send those along to colin@colinmarshallradio.com. For our complete interview archive, visit colinmarshallradio.com, and for the website of the man who produces our theme music, visit benalthouse.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.